Good evening and welcome to Hemispheres. My name's Richard Curtis and I'll be your host this evening. This evening we're going to do something a little bit different, a little bit more philosophical than news-oriented, which is a unique departure for Hemispheres. And we certainly would appreciate any feedback you have about this particular show. You can give a call to the comment line, and I'll have to try and figure out what that phone number is so I can tell you later. But we're going to start this evening with a commentary that I recorded earlier dealing with a different way of looking at religion. And we're going to take that as a jumping off point and start from there. So without further ado, here we go.
Curtis. Mircea Eliade, who was perhaps the most important theorist of the history of religion in the 20th century, has described human beings as essentially religious. Eliade was a believer, but what if there really is no God? The non-existence of God does not answer the great questions in the history of religion, but asks more. If there is no God or gods, why do humans behave in ways that many people describe as essentially religious? If we take Friedrich Engels at his word, and he was not a believer, the fundamental nature of reality is material and dialectical. If reality is the material world, and it moves dialectically, that is, in very complicated ways, perhaps what we have previously understood as religious behavior is simply the behavior of humans trying to cope with a mysterious world. We may speculate that our world is mysterious not because of the elusiveness of a god or gods, but because of the complexity of its dialectical motion. Religion has always expressed our sense of awe in the face of mystery and beauty. From the position of this new evaluation of religion without God or gods, there is a great deal to be learned from religious behavior, theology, and the ritual practices of human beings around the world. From the dialectical materialist point of view, there are in fact three levels of religious expression which are necessary to all societies. These three are the social, the existential, and the aesthetic. We observe that our biology delimits certain possibilities and imposes certain necessities. Among these is the fact of our being social creatures, animals that live together and must of necessity cooperate to some significant degree. Then, there is the complexity introduced by thought, which results in particular in the need for collective consensus about our societies and selves. We need to know how we fit together and what we are to make of our lives. This is the existential. We also find and must incorporate the fact that being human ultimately involves an aesthetic sensibility, which includes the capacity for wonder and even awe. This aesthetic level is the one we often think about first in describing religion, the poetic side of being human. Religion, even understood without idealism, without God and God talk, must still take into account these three very different but very integrated levels in which being human expresses itself. Religion, most significantly though, addresses the question of how human beings fit in the world and fit together. Engels taught that this level of reality too is determined by the material world and moves dialectically. The sociologist Peter Berger has argued that religion forms the basis for social constructions of reality. Even though these constructions may have been attributed to God or gods, societies are the creations of human beings. These creations are complicated and have relied upon religious understandings of reality, as Eliade described, for their justifications. Berger's analysis implies that even after humans have progressed to the point of recognizing these social constructions as being our own profane creations, the complexity remains, and the necessity for intentionally creating meaning in society remains. In a fully democratic society, the decisions regarding the ways in which society should be constructed fall to everyone rather than remaining the domain of a ruling class. Our future socialist society will construct social definitions of reality more freely than before, but these constructions will inevitably draw upon the religious language and forms of the past, even though the content will have been divorced from notions of the sacred or divine. In conclusion, it's important to acknowledge that Marxism, especially since the Soviet experiment, has been seen as cold and lifeless, science without enough poetry. Marxists themselves may resist this formulation because we have an experience of the human or poetic side of dialectics. However, the demands of revolutionary struggle most especially including the struggle against religious ways of subverting class consciousness, fighting the narcotic effect of idealist religion, has forced an emphasis on the scientific side of scientific socialism. However, socialism is about the free expression of human beings and therefore will inevitably recapture its poetic side. It is hoped that the present discussion will contribute to an early rediscovery of this fuzzy and human side of dialectical materialism and to its fuller articulation. As Marx put it in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, religion is an expression of humanity's imperfect self-awareness, not human as abstract individual, but as social being, collective being. Thus far, religion is a distortion of human existence because society has been distorted.
And joining me in the studio this evening, I have the honor of welcoming a couple of professors, both of whom I've learned from. So in part, I guess we have to blame them a little bit for what you've been listening to. Professor Ira Chernus of the Department of Religious Studies, and Dr. Sheralee Brindell, who has taught in the past, but not at the moment,
currently.
with the philosophy department at the both at the University of Colorado. So welcome.
Thank you, Richard.
We'll make sure we got, got sound coming from both of you. So the reason actually that I've invited these honorable professors in is to help explore some of the ideas that I was alluding to in the commentary we were just listening to. And I suppose the most obvious place to start is with this Mircea Eliade guy, who was formative in the field of religious studies, actually mostly working out of the University of Chicago in the 50s and 60s?
Right, he came to Chicago originally from Romania, then via Paris. He came to Chicago in the mid-50s and was a very influential historian of religion there through the 1980s. For the professional historians of religion who may be listening in, they'll know, of course, that Eliade is not nearly as influential today. That's, I suppose, the fate of any great figure in academia, is that they have their day and then they decline or give way to newer ideas. But I think his ideas are rich enough, complex enough, that it's always possible to find something new in them, as you were suggesting in your commentary. Eliade himself would be, if he were if he were still alive, he'd be turning over in his grave.
Aghast.
For sure, because he really had no sympathy with Marxist ideas, and unfortunately, the way those ideas were put into practice in his native Romania were left him aghast, to say the least, when he heard some of the horror stories. Even if half of them were true, it's pretty horrible enough. Eliade himself actually leaned far to the right, and that's one of the reasons I think that his ideas are no longer as influential as they once were. When a biographer who could actually read Romanian went to Romania and started reading about Eliade's political ideas in his younger days, it turned out that he had some sort of fascist tendencies. Probably not anti-Semitic, not overtly anti-Semitic, but fascist in the, if there is a best sense of that word. And so he seems like an odd place to begin any sort of discussion that's going to quickly lead to Marx and Engels. But nevertheless, there are actually some, I think, interesting and rich resources in Eliade's own ideas about religion that people on the left as well as on the right can draw from.
Well, and I think that you can probably do a little bit more justice to what it was I was getting at in saying that Eliade viewed people as essentially religious creatures.
Yeah, his, in an odd way, his fascism was a response to being discouraged or maybe disgusted with modern Western society, secular capitalist society. I don't think he clearly saw how capitalism itself was the driving agent from a Marxist point of view behind the ills that he was responding to, but he was aware, nevertheless, that secular society was linked to capitalist society, and he argued that there had been a real loss, that the full human capacity for spiritual life, the full human capacity for the life of the imagination, the full capacity to be really human, had been drained away by modern Western capitalist society. Of course, he also argued that modern Eastern Marxist society had done the same thing, but he may have been wrong about that. Or I think perhaps you'd prefer to say that he didn't see the potential for a Marxist revolution to recover the full humanness that had been lost under capitalism.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of what he did had to do with surveying the world and describing religions in various parts of the world and similarities.
That's where the historians of religion listening in may sit up and be a little bit offended or dismayed to hear you say that. And that's where the controversy really comes in terms of Eliade's role now in religious studies, because he claimed that he was simply surveying, that he was surveying and then generalizing. I think it's pretty well agreed today by everyone in the field that he wasn't really doing that. He did take in an immense amount of data, but he gave that data what we would call today his own spin. And it was a very complex spin, but he was creating an image of what it means to be human that appealed to him, that really sort of enthralled him, and was romanticizing the religions of the past and arguing that they actually did instantiate that particular way of being human. And when you start looking at his data carefully from a really rigorous historical perspective, most of it pretty well falls apart. Another thing that makes it difficult to use Eliade from a left perspective is that the one cultural area that seems to support his view of religiosity is the great urban centers of the ancient world, of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, probably ancient China, perhaps the ancient Mesoamerican world. And of course, those were not exactly liberated societies. I mean, that's in a certain sense where the kind of oppressive hierarchical structures that Marxists want to dismantle had their origin. And those are the societies that really hold up best when compared with Eliade's theories of what it means to be religious.
Which fit his own personal political persuasions
yes,
as well.
That may very well be true.
Now, you used one of those buzzwords in the field, religiosity.
Right.
What does that mean?
Oh, I think that everybody who works professionally in the study of religion has their own definition or their own understanding, or then there are some people who would just prefer to dodge that question completely and say that religiosity means whatever people want it to mean.
Are you one of those people?
I think you dodged it.
But I think, in fact, that's probably the most accurate answer. That's like saying, what does love mean? What does happiness mean? What does goodness mean? Those are words that we're constantly using in constantly changing contexts, and so we give those words the meaning that seems most appropriate or most useful at the time. So if we go back to the question, well, what did Eliade mean by religiosity? He used the word, the concept, as a way of protesting against what he saw as the ills and the evils of modern Western secular society. And remember, he was a Romanian, and partly this was a protest against the way in which Western European society had colonized culturally, colonized Romania, and he felt, many of his peers felt, had sort of gutted the true greatness and glory of indigenous Romanian culture. So in a certain sense, he was protesting on behalf of his own indigenous culture, which I guess from a left perspective is a very respectable thing to do, but he was sort of unfortunately doing it in some right-wing ways. But I don't think we have to get hung up on that, because he really was suggesting then a notion of religiosity that could serve as a powerful sort of foundation or platform for launching intellectual protests, cultural protests, and maybe even social protests against the oppressive structures and the oppressive forms of Western capitalist secular society. So in that sense, he was inventing his notion of religion, but everybody invents their notion of religion. There's nothing wrong with that. He was claiming that he wasn't doing that. He was claiming that he was simply reading the nature of religion off the data, and he was probably wrong about that. But that's okay. You know, everybody, in a certain sense, invents their notion of religion for specific purposes. And so the question is, you know, were his purposes constructive? And as I've suggested, in some ways they were not, but in some ways they really were. Certainly he was... what was he protesting against? Well, one of the things that he was protesting against was what he called the banality of Western society, the way in which the modern Western world had reduced everything to its cash value. Now here, of course, if Marx were with us, he would probably sit up and take notice and discover an unlikely bedfellow.
And I suppose that's where I come in. And on that subject, we might want to bring Sheralee in, because what I'm, or at least what's being suggested is that there's something to what Eliade was saying about people being religious and about the vacuousness of capitalist culture as he was protesting it in Western Europe. But that something is connected with human experience of the physical world rather than human experience of a spiritual world. And it's at that point that the significance of dialectical philosophy, I think comes up, because dialectical philosophy is a philosophy of complex motion of physical matter. And so that was why I asked Sheralee to join us, being trained in the Western philosophical tradition, to explain...
Overtrained, I think.
Okay, overtrained. To try and give the audience a little bit better sense of what dialectics is than I can give.
Well, that's really very hard. In many cases, it depends upon, like with religiosity, it depends upon who you ask what dialectics is. If you ask Hegel, dialectical philosophy is going to be a very different thing than if you were to ask Engels. These are dialectically opposed conceptions of what dialectical philosophy is. But at their core, they both, whether they're going to be idealist or materialist, at their core, they both want to describe a certain kind of motion of phenomena, be it physical or human, that tends to be... This is very difficult to describe. They cash it out in terms of of a negation of a negation, and in terms of contradictions being present in the world. And the existence of contradictions, for example, creates certain tensions between, classically in Hegel's philosophy, in the master-slave dialectic, there is a tension between two individuals, each of whom desires recognition from the other, and neither of whom wants to give recognition in order to achieve it. So you get this fundamental tension between them that is, they attempt to resolve through a struggle to the death. And this is a very classic way of conceiving dialectical movement. You've got a tension, some sort of opposite activity, and the only way to resolve the tension is somehow to overcome, transcend, or otherwise move through the two original entities. Hegel described it, and I believe others do as well, in terms of a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis of the thesis and the antithesis.
I might interject here to bring Eliade into conversation again with Engels, and I suspect both of them coming off of Hegel in different ways, that if you asked Eliade, well, why is the Western society so banal? He would say not only because it's reduced everything to cash calculable values, but at a deeper level because it has given up the ability to imagine a harmonization, a transcendence of opposites.
The synthesis.
The synthesis, right. Again, he didn't really credit, I think, Marx's thought with being able to do that. And so his argument was, at least as long as capitalism prevails, and now I'm giving sort of a left Eliadean interpretation, as long as capitalism prevails, we will be sort of impaled on the horns of the law of non-contradiction, right?
And a lovely law that is.
Yes, well, we'll have to choose either or. And his argument was essentially that the religious imagination really begins, religiosity really begins when we imagine transcending opposites, the opposition between the material and the spiritual, the opposition between life and death. And one might argue or add then the opposition between national groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, and such. Right? But it was always that harmonization of opposites that was the key to genuine religiosity in his thinking.
And so Sheralee, how then does this dialectic get played out in Marx and Engels?
Once again, a very tough question. I think it gets played out differently in Marx than it does in Engels. I think the fundamental tension, for as far as I can see in Marx, is a human, psychological, social phenomenon. But then Engels develops this tension and I'm going to say projects it into the natural world. So, at some level, Engels' dialectical materialism is in some sense a monolectical materialism because it wants to be monist, right? There is one and only one thing, matter.
The material.
Right? It becomes a little bit more difficult to come up with easy foils for a dialectical opposition. We may find them in the world nonetheless, but my sense in looking over what Engels had to say about this again was that while he did want to say that the natural world moved according to certain dialectical patterns, to say this is not to say much about the world. It's kind of like an animist saying, well, the world, the universe, has purposes. Okay, and now that you know that, what do you do? It really doesn't tell you very much about the world at all. And so far as I can see, Engels desired this to be a very, very general theory about the world, not something that's intended to give you any very specific information at all. And it then becomes a project of what he likes to call metaphysics, to go about and do some of the more specific investigatory work. So when you ask, how does dialectics play itself out in the philosophies of Marx and Engels, for Marx, there's a very important controversy regarding this very question. What it meant for Marx to say that this was an inevitable process. I still don't know what he means by that. I mean, Engels wanted to say, look, it's quite clear that he doesn't mean somehow it's necessary in some sense, but it's. I mean, I'm just not clear about what that really means. It's a very tough and difficult question, and Marx wasn't the most perspicuous writer in the history of the world. You have to spend a lot of time really looking at what he could mean.
Maybe that's why people still do so often.
Well, yes, it's very much worth the effort to sit and try and figure out what he could mean, because he didn't come out and say in many cases what he did mean.
And the way that I got into this notion, that the way that it occurred to me that there might be something connected with religion that had to do with dialectical materialism, was reading one of Engels' books, Anti-Düring, which was a philosophical work criticizing the work of a German philosopher named Düring, who's since passed off the radar screen, as they say. But Anti-Düring survives.
He's only famous because
of
somebody
That's right.
opposed him.
He's almost only famous in the negation.
Right.
And in that work, one of the things that Engels describes about his dialectical material understanding of reality is that in the physical sciences, when one brings it down to that level and starts looking at the way physics works or the way chemistry works, that something very important in the mathematical equations involving the square root of -1 arises. And he suggested that a mathematical description would depend upon a solution of the square root of -1. Well, for those of you who've studied a little bit of math, you might know that in general it's held that the square root of -1 has no solution. But interestingly enough, around the same time I was reading this book Chaos by a man named Gleichman. Gleich? Okay.
James Gleich.
A journalist who covers issues of science, and he got interested in chaos theory, which more properly, I suppose, is known as complexity theory. And the mathematicians in particular who were involved in trying to find solutions to particularly complex equations, complex motion of matter, they were looking at the movement of fluids in the way heat transfers and the way fluid moves. Anyway, they discovered that these equations hinged on a solution for the square root of -1. And modern mathematical theory has come up with solutions for the square root of -1, so that chaos theory these days makes use of some of this higher mathematics. So this got me thinking, okay, what if Engels was right? What if we just, for the sake of conversation at least, assume that that's true, that the world really is material and it really does move dialectically? What does that assumption lead us to when we think about religion? And I grew up an atheist, so I happened to do a master's degree in religious studies because I was curious about it, but not because I believed. And that has always been a problem, I think, for atheists. What does religion really mean if you don't believe? Is it really just self-deception?
I don't yet see how that question is connected with Mr. Engels. Maybe we've got another 30 minutes, right?
Yes,
I expect,
that's where we're going.
I am
Look
confident
for the connection.
that by 7 o'clock I'll see it. But let me push this a little further and see whether it's at all helpful. There's an argument to be made, and one of the more famous people who made it is a sociologist whom you mentioned in your initial commentary, Peter Berger. And the argument is that one of the crucial functions of religion is to give people a sense of order in their lives. Not a great profound insight, but that people organize the world in terms of propositions, what they believe to be true. And that particularly in monotheistic religions, if you believe it to be true that there is only one God and that God created the world, that's a pretty powerful a sort of firm foundation to create a sense of order and structure in the world. Now, one of the things that's interesting about my friend Eliade here is that he certainly acknowledged this function of religion. But I think he had a sense that that particular aspect of life had been very successfully dealt with in secular society. We have plenty of sense of order, you know, that our schools impose order, our devotion to mathematics imposes order, our devotion to science and technology, right? Or at least let's say a devotion to a certain sense of order, a fantasy perhaps of order. But remember, Eliade was so concerned about how you bring together opposites. And perhaps the most crucial set of opposites that fascinated him was the opposition between order and chaos. And again, he believed that before modern times, when people were religious, or at least let's say the way he imagined them to have been religious, he imagined that they were people who had a sizable dose of order, but they knew how to let go of the order. They knew how to accept the limitations to the orderliness, whether it be in society or in nature, on any level. They knew how to accept and even to prize and value the dimension of chaos in the world, because chaos is the energizing factor in the world. It's when order breaks down that exciting things begin to happen, new things begin to happen, sometimes revolutionary things begin to happen. And again, from a Marxist perspective, it's very interesting to read Eliade on chaos, on the positive values of chaos and times of chaos, because his vision is that out of chaos comes rebirth, rejuvenation. Of course, the price you pay is that the old must be dissolved and destroyed, you know, kind of classic revolutionary language.
Well,
now, I think there's some
okay.
connections here with chaos theory, and why don't you go ahead and pursue that?
Well, that's where I wanted to jump in,
Right.
was that what I'm suggesting is that what Eliade understood as chaos is not chaos in the generic, ordinary run-of-the-mill usage of the word, but complexity in terms of this complexity theory or chaos theory. So the laws of dialectics are still operable even in what we perceive as chaos.
Let me go ahead.
If I may,
Please.
because this thought is occurring to me regardless of how it is that we understand chaos, whether we understand it in terms of this energizing principle or whether we understand it in terms of complexity. I mean, my own sense of and this is an intuitive sense and reflective but non-expert sense of what people are after with religion speaks to this problem of chaos quite directly. And it seems to me, especially early in human history, there was plenty of chaos to go around. What we didn't have was stability and permanence. This is what we needed. There were all kinds, virtually nothing in the world were things that we truly understood. Lightning storms, earthquakes, things that grow, things that die. I mean, the whole world was just this mysterious, unpredictable, chaotic center of activity. And here you have cognizing beings attempting...
That would be people.
Some people.
All right, so you have basic the potential for cognizing beings attempting to operate in such a world. And what they really want, more than anything else, is something permanent, something eternal, something fixed, something that doesn't fluctuate, something they can count on. And it seems to me that what human beings have done is, as Feuerbach noted, project that into the sky, a place that doesn't change. You look at it, it's the same every night. And so it seems to me that attempting to satisfy what I take to be a true human need, and I think Marx would probably have to recognize this as well, to attempt to locate that in a process that is by its very nature overly complex might be problematic. I mean, it's unclear that you can actually achieve the result that you desire by making reference to the dialectic as the sort of thing that's supposed to answer this kind of, I think, very real human need.
Eliade was very well aware of that analysis of religion, and
Ooh, is that a real analysis?
sure.
Well,
Okay.
Feuerbach,
I wouldn't know.
And he accepted it as partially valid, and I think pushed it a couple of steps further in really interesting ways. Because what he argued is, yes, absolutely. And again, let's remember, he's inventing a notion of religion that he feels is spiritual, will spiritually nurture people in the Western world who have been sort of banalized. Okay, and he's saying, yes, it's necessary to have some sense of permanence, but you can't have that the dimension of chaos. And if you successfully integrate it in imaginative structures, in symbols, in myths, in rituals,
Yes.
if you integrate the chaos into the structure and order such as it is or such as you're able to create it, right, and accept the limitations of the order, only then do you get a genuine sense of what is permanent, eternal, and fulfilling.
There
that
is
was
something
his argument.
quite dialectical about this because just as we don't want too much chaos, right? Too much chaos and, oh, you go nuts. Also, you don't want too much order. I mean, you need a healthy balance of those things. And I think it's true. I mean, it seems to me intuitively quite plausible and quite attractive to speak in terms of integration, because as I was going back over, questions of what does Marx mean by species being, it seemed to me, I tried to answer that question in terms of his conception of alienation. And it seemed to me that what alienation was a very specific kind of disintegration. That was really what it was that he was trying to point to, was that human beings, their essences, their activities, their surroundings were completely disintegrated, and that what we wanted was a fully integrated entity, and that the difficulty, right, the hole that religion attempts to fill is one of these elements that is missing from the integrated whole.
And probably the most famous, best-known part of Eliade's work is his observation that in many religious cultures and communities, and here I think he's probably empirically correct, you see a temporal pattern, that is a pattern imposed in time and in history, of alternating periods of integration and disintegration. And that his criticism of modern Western society is that we refuse the times of disintegration. To put it in political terms, we refuse the times of revolution, right? That we attempt to construct a particular order, a democratic, capitalist order, a republican order in our case, those political adjectives with small case letters, a democratic republic, capitalist economic system, and we cling to that order, and we refuse to accept the need or even the possibility of any periods of disintegration, so that when any forces come along that might threaten that disintegration, such as, for example, the brilliance of a Karl Marx, right, rather than accepting the inevitability of going through phases of disintegration and reintegration, we simply fight back. Even if it means using nuclear weapons, we fight back. And so what he wanted to say is that the full integration comes when you accept the endless cycle of integration, disintegration, and reintegration. And again, that's what religion is supposed to be about from his perspective, is providing us with the myths, the symbols, the rituals that will give us a structure within which we can periodically disintegrate ourselves, our society, the world itself. And then be reintegrated. Now, there's clearly a kind of a Christian bias here, except that you don't die and get resurrected only once in Eliade's system. You do it over and over again, even if it just means going to church every Easter and drinking the wine and eating the wafer.
You see, that's why I invited you all into the studio, is because what you're describing is what I think I'm trying to get at. That understanding that dialectical materialism can describe the way history moves as well as the way matter moves does not mean that one no longer experiences it as chaos. that's why chaos theory is called chaos theory.
Yeah,
it's still chaos.
although, I mean, Ira here is pointing very distinctly in the direction of something that I took to be a fundamental problem with this kind of project. And it relates to the human tendency to resist revolution, to resist the chaos, rather than to accept it and proceed. And what I noticed in my reading of the work and thinking about all of this was, it seems as though there is something about human beings that is fundamentally at odds, intrinsically, inherently, irretrievably at odds with a world that is construed dialectically. If you suppose that what this means is that the nature of the universe is change, is movement, is
Right.
non-static, right? And what it is that a human being seeks, it's maybe not above all other things, but certainly undeniably seeks, is some kind of permanence, then it seems as though there's a fundamental and non-eliminable tension between the human being and the world in which he finds himself.
If Eliade were with us, at this point he would jump up and get very excited and
Good.
say, no, no, no.
Oh, bummer.
Well,
he can say no as much as he
what
likes.
you identify as the fundamental trait of human nature is actually a fundamental trait of the modern Western secular person raised in an irretrievably bourgeois capitalist culture.
Oh, I would say he's just
Well, that's
wrong
it's kind of
about
Marxist
that.
of him,
I
too.
mean,
Well,
this has been going on
But
since way before
that's what he
Plato.
would say. And he would go on to say, right, that the real dialectic, the dialectic that we need to discover, he would say recover, I'd say discover, is the dialectical interaction between the kind of permanence that we may all want and the inevitability of change. That it's only, that, again, those who accept change, that endless cycle of disintegration and reintegration, right? It's only those who genuinely accept that cycle and live it out in religious forms who genuinely have a sense of permanence, because the only thing that is permanent is that cycle of change.
I would just have to protest that the history of ideas from Heraclitus on is merely an enactment of the very drama I have just presented, and that the introduction of Platonic forms is a way of solving the problem posed by Heraclitean flux, and I mean, just continually insisting on some kind of permanent fixed idea as being out there and capable of solving the third man problem and all sorts of goofy little problems in the history of philosophy, I think attests to the fact that we have been pursuing this since, well, who knows when Heraclitus
If you're only going to go back to Heraclitus, then means
that's
Western
long,
way.
That's long enough. It's certainly pre-capitalist.
Yes,
for crying
but
out
it's
loud.
rather ethnocentric.
Well, yes, but these are the only ideas I know.
well, again, this is why we study the history of religion, so that we can have a little bit of sense of what's gone on in the South Sea Islands and what's gone on.
It certainly
in,
can't be
the
located
Himalayas
in
and
capitalist society. I mean, I think that would be to push the point
Well,
beyond.
But my point is connected
plausibility.
with what you're suggesting, though, is that that even after the reasons why religion flourishes as the opium of the people, which is something I clearly accept as a critique of religion, that even after those causal factors have gone away, what I'm suggesting is that religion, in some sense of the word, will remain in order to deal with that very problem of human beings confronting an ever-changing universe.
Yes, I simply wouldn't
That's the whole point.
locate the solution in the dialectic. I think that's actually the problem rather than the solution. But I mean, I could be approaching this backwards. I mean, maybe looking to the source of the problem is exactly how you solve it.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that dialectical materialism is just the way we describe the problem, and that finding
I see.
solutions is a different kind of endeavor.
I see. That's something I actually misunderstood.
The solutions need to be informed, obviously, by our understanding of the nature of the problem, but the problem is intractable because the universe is ever-changing.
And if the problem is intractable, then maybe the genuinely profound spirituality is simply to stop trying to solve it and to recognize that it's not a problem, it simply is the world that we live in. And there's a way to read Eliade's work to have him say that. There's a way to read his work to have him say something quite different. But one could read his work as saying that that's precisely the point, that it is the truly religious person is the person who is simply in tune with the constant movements of life, and that what is most oppressive in society stems from the efforts to stop that movement, that the people at the top, the bosses, are the people who want to construct patterns and structures by which they can control processes, and that means controlling people, and that's the source of oppressive structures, and that therefore religion is liberating in the political and social sense and economic sense, precisely insofar as it liberates our imaginations to imagine a society that is genuinely in tune with this endless dialectical process, and then the dialectical process is no longer a problem.
Well, that's a good point, and taking me to task on the use of that word "problem," but I would have to disagree with a little bit of the way you're formulating that, because it's not. I don't envision that coming up with a better understanding of religion or of our relationship with the dialectical world will actually solve anything or change anything, motivate revolution. But I'm suggesting that even from this vantage point of history, that we can see into some, glimmers of future possibility, and suppose that this religious understanding will come back.
Well, you may be
Not that we can create it now, but that
you
it
may
will
be
come
selling
back.
this idea short. It may have more of a liberative power than you want to give it credit for.
I mean, certainly, if, as your commentary suggested, there is something unpoetic about the Soviet experiment, or how it is that dialectical materialism has been viewed so far, and that human beings do in fact need and have aesthetic sensibilities. They do in fact need poetry. It seems to me that there is in fact a problem that requires solution, and that's how to go about having a life that's properly human.
Perhaps in a deeper sense, what human beings need is creativity. And it may be that the way Marxism has been acted out so far in the stage of political history has not encouraged the average person's creativity, but nevertheless, in Marx's own writings, there's certainly plenty of resources for encouraging creativity. And
Well, I think you are, forgetting that there was this amazing flowering of poetics and human creativity that came with the Russian Revolution. That at the time that they did have a very profound sense that there was something more significant than just economics.
I've been told that Cuba is a good example of this too.
The flowering of humanity.
And where this might hook up with this particular notion of religion that I've been talking about is in the idea that creativity really flourishes, obviously, when we can break free of the dominant structures, the dominant patterns, when we no longer need to cling to a fixed sense of order. And those are those times of disintegration, of chaos, that Eliade wants to claim every religion ought to have a way to celebrate, that kind of immersion into those periods of chaos is the liberating moment, because it's the moment in which creativity is set free, the moment in which the imagination is set free, the moment in which the aesthetic and artistic impulses are set free. And of course, then you've got to come back to a more sort of ordinary everyday life in which those are given some sort of form and order, but I presume that's what every aesthetic is striving for, is sort of again a kind of a harmonization of the tension between structure or pattern and free creativity. So that too can be seen as a function of religion, or as a religious function.
Well, at that point, I would be at a loss for any sense at all of what religion might mean. I mean, it seems to me, you know, if we're talking in terms of a fully integrated human being who's freely creative and all of this, the kinds of things that we come to expect when we talk about our species being fully actualized, I lose track of what it is that's going to be reintroduced. For example, a reawakening of a religion. I mean, it becomes unclear to me what role it is that religion is going to have. Even with a small r, I don't understand
right.
what this thing is, or what it would be doing, or what use anyone might have for it.
Well, Eliada's answer is really imagination. I think in Freudian language, we might say that he saw the modern Western secular world as the dominance of the ego, and that religion is the way in which a community structures its periodic collective dipping into the id.
Yes, that's actually quite nice.
And does it in ways that are socially sanctioned, although Eliade was fascinated with the notion of ritual orgies, but that was only a sidelight, I think.
Who isn't?
I just wanted
somehow
to give
sets him out.
No, I just wanted to give a sort of a full picture of his personality.
Very full. Thank you very much.
But I don't think we need to bring the Freudian language in. But there's this sense that that the capitalist system has has commodified imagination, and if you doubt that, just turn on your television, right, and wait till the next commercial. It won't be long, and that in order to have any sense of what it means to be a full, genuine, creative human being, right, that you need to escape from the very narrow confines of imagination into which we've been poured as products of a secular capitalist society, and to be awakened and opened up precisely by religion, which sounds very strange to a lot of people, because we're so accustomed to thinking of religion as the oppressive force, which it certainly can be. I think the sort of punchline of this whole thing is simply that religion need not necessarily be the oppressive force, that it can be imagined as just the opposite, as the force that liberates us from oppression.
Well, and I think I'm suggesting something perhaps more mundane, which is that religion is that which structures our relationship to the complexity of the dialectical motion of the universe, and that social function, that necessary human social function, is not dependent on the details of how society is structured. The details come out in the particulars of the religion, and so a different structure to society would create a different kind of religion, but the necessity of relating to what we're calling chaos remains.
Yeah, I think the question is simply whether the religious forms give an opportunity to appreciate the energizing power, the creative and rejuvenating power of those experiences of chaos. And I think some religious forms do allow for that and some don't, but that at least the argument that Eliade and many others have given is that without religion in our secular society, it's increasingly extremely difficult to access that sense of the energizing power of chaos.
And that is also important in a way, because the one underlying implication of reality being material and dialectical is that we are material and dialectical, that we participate in that chaos, that our entire being is a product of that chaos. And so there's some level at which I have to appreciate it, and I think that's where I was referring to Eliade's notions of aesthetic sensibilities, that I think that's where awe comes from.
If I may.
Okay. Briefly.
Oh, okay, very briefly. I am concerned about the possibility for speaking fully, richly about notions of creativity, were we to do as the thesis suggests, which is to take Engels at his word. It strikes me that there is a distinct epistemic problem that we've discussed in private conversations regarding the possibility of an active role for mind. And it's not clear to me how it is that we can have all of this in one basket.
And I put the emphasis, I guess, on the role of mind is perceptive.
Yes,
and interactive, perhaps, but not essentially creative. On the epistemic level you're talking about.
It strikes me that what you've got here is a very creative world. I mean, you even described it as world-building sort of a project, and it seems to me that you've got a very thin wire along which you are attempting to walk.
A thin epistemological wire. Yes. Oh my!
But isn't that the best wire for all of us to attempt
Oh
to
yeah,
walk?
because if you get across to the other side, boy, are you heroic.
Well, with that, I suppose I'll have to thank you both for joining us.
Well, Richard, I'd like to thank you for raising Hemispheres and KGNU to new intellectual heights, or some may say depths. But
oh, thanks.
it was certainly at least a very enriching and enjoyable experience here.
And that was Professor Ira Chernus of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Colorado, my master's thesis advisor, I should confess. So we go back a ways. We've also been talking with Sheralee Brindell, who has, in the past, and I know because I had a class, taught philosophy at the University of Colorado. My name's Richard Curtis, and I've been your host this evening on Hemispheres. Please join us again next week for another exciting adventure. This is KGNU Boulder, and coming up next we have Corriente.